Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jana Leontieva. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Sociology, Academy of Sciences, and I will be chairing this afternoon panel where we have two honored guests. And our first speaker is MariaCaterina La Barbera, who is a full professor at the Department of Law at Nebrija University in Madrid, where she teaches undergraduate courses. She holds a PhD in human rights, and her research focused on critical studies of law and public policy, with a special focus on intersection between gender equality and cultural diversity. She's an author of the monograph Multi-Centered Feminism, and two edited volumes, including the book published by Springer in 2015 called Identity and Migration in Europe. She's an author of numerous articles and index journals and book chapters, and those publications are mostly addressing topics like equality and non-discrimination policies, migration and integration policies, identity formation and diversity. And her today's presentation is on intersecting gender and border structural vulnerabilities. So please, the floor is yours. You have approximately half an hour plus 15 minutes for discussion.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, and thank you to Susanna and Petra for this wonderful conference. It has been really a pleasure to listen to you all, and I have my head full of new ideas and concepts. As she said, I'm a legal scholar. I do feminist critical legal theory, and my focus are gender and migration regime. As a legal scholar, I like to start with something practical, and so I will illustrate the particular legal framework of Spain. Sorry. The gender regime, the Spanish gender regime. And starting from this point, I will try to build some theoretical contribution and conceptual tools related to migration and global justice. Equality between women and men is one of the millennium goals. Yet, many strategies adopted to pursue such a goal rely on an essentialized woman subject and reproduce inequality. I'm glad to be here and have the opportunity to discuss the detrimental practical implications of exclusionary conceptualization of equality. Focusing in particular on migrant women, I aim to contribute to the debate on global justice and transnational migration. I argue that exclusionary equality policies are a source of global inequality within the current border configuration of the planet that is currently characterized by a huge economic divide and massive migratory movements. My talk, as I said, is structured in two parts. In the first part, I will illustrate gender equality policies and the situation of migrant women working in the care sector in Spain. And the second one, I will discuss the concept of group-based vulnerability and its limits. I will argue that to understand how the global market, economic crisis, and international migration deeply affect women, to look at gender in isolation is not enough. It is rather required to understand gender as a social structure that is intertwined with other fundamental axes of social organization, such as sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, religion, citizenship and migration status, educational and occupational level, health and age, intersectionality in a word. Such a complex intertwining gives a better account of how privileges and power are distributed among the world population and across national borders. Through this way, I think we can avoid to set up exclusionary equality policies that, as it occurs in Spain, trying to improve gender equality standards, reproduce vulnerability for migrant women. So, the case of Spain. I think Spain constitutes an excellent laboratory to test the practical implication of equality policies and their implications that are detrimental for migrant women working in the care sector. Key factors explain the situation of exploited migrant women in the Spanish domestic sector, and these are the incorporation of Spanish women into the formal labor market, the gendered and racialized segmentation of the labor market, the feministic welfare state regime, and the dismantling of social policies through the post-crisis austerity policies. Spanish welfare state is characterized by the universalization of health, education, and pension system on the one hand, and by the familiarization of the care regime on the other. While the state maintains a residual role, care depends mainly on families, which are still fundamentally based on a traditional division of gender roles. Feminism of the Spanish welfare state is especially evident when focusing on the regulation of parental leave that we were discussing this morning. Today, maternal leave is 16 weeks of fully paid absence. The first 6 weeks, I'm sorry for this specificity of the terms, but I think it's useful to understand the situation and then discuss the conceptual problems related to that. So these first 6 weeks are mandatory for the mother and are not transferable. The remaining 10 non-compulsory weeks can be transferred to the father only if the mother is employed. That means they are not transferable if she's self-employed, that this is not considered employment. It's very curious. Although both parents' leaves are 100% remunerated, mostly mother apply for it because that incentives does not exist. So the traditional gender norms are reproduced, and the female caregiver, male breadwinner model is still enforced. 10 years ago, the Equality Act established a distinctive measure, an exclusive and yet optional 2-week leave for the father after the childbirth. Although it was a very important news in the Spanish legislation, this leave obviously is too short to create the father-child bonding that can work as a push factor to transform the traditional division of care roles. Although in 2009 an extension to 4 weeks of the exclusive leave for fathers was established, for austerity reasons this budget was not approved until last year. Work-life balance still is far from being reality in Spain. Companies have very long and inflexible working days, and the workplace is dominated by the politics of essentialism. The longer you stay at office, the better. According to national statistical data, parents spend an average of 2 hours per day with their children during the week. This very limited time is enjoyed mostly by mothers. In a recent case law before the European Court of Human Rights, a woman litigated for 10 years the recognition of the violation of her right to reduce working hours to take care of her child that was under 6 years old. This was the provision of the Spanish legislation at that time. However, when her right to reduce working hours was recognized, because of the slowness of the trial, as I said, it last 10 years, a right was eventually unenforceable because the right was linked to the age of the child, and it was grown up already, of course. Although this case, and she was finally compensated because her right was not enforceable anymore. Although this case can be defined as a successful one because she was granted compensation, in the Spanish context, similar cases are not even brought to court. Litigation is costly and is long. The issue of care, the care of children in particular, is individually and more quickly solved by relying on the work of low-paid migrant domestic workers. Between 2000 and 2009, the foreign-born population, of which I'm part of because I'm an Italian living in Madrid, increased, reaching more than 5 million people. During the years of economic growth, the number of employed migrant women also enormously increased. Data indicates that 1 in 3 migrant women in Spain worked in the domestic and care sector in those years. Spanish policy instruments for the selection of migratory flows, which adapt the supply of foreign workers to internal labor demand, offered almost 100% of profiles that are identified as male profiles: livestock workers, electricians, truck driver, mason, welder, plaster, and machine operators. Strict immigration channels and low representation of female profiles result in higher numbers of migrant domestic workers who are undocumented or in a situation of irregularity, of administrative irregularity, and thus particularly vulnerable to human rights violations. An irregular administrative situation or the need to renew the short-term permit prevent, of course, the negotiation of salary or acceptable working conditions. During the crisis, in addition, the average salary of the worker decreased, but families still need to rely on domestic and care service for which they can pay less. Within this framework, migrant women working in the care sector mostly work under exploitative working conditions. So I think the case of Spain is not unique, although it's very representative. And Spain is really interesting, a really interesting case because the gender regimes develop very fast and very well according to EU standards, but still I think the conceptualization that lie behind the equality is an exclusionary idea of equality. So I will try to explain why I think that, this kind of exclusionary conceptualization of gender equality has detrimental implication in praxis. So in this second part, I will pass to a more conceptual critique of these ideas that lies behind the policies. The public-private dichotomy, according to which productive and reproductive work has been rigidly attributed to men and women respectively, has been identified by feminist theory as the main source of women inequalities. Feminist legal theorists in particular warned about the need to tackle the system of subordination that generates systematic exposure to discrimination for women as a historically disadvantaged group. Since 1979, when the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was adopted, it has been established that recognizing equality before the law and removing formal obstacles to enjoy equal opportunity is not enough. The understanding of equality in its substantive dimension entails a transformative project. That is the commitment to transform the society as a whole towards justice. Addressing the substantive dimension of equality requires 3 steps: recognizing the power relations and social structures that impair equality de facto, analyzing the effect of equal treatment within the existent unbalanced social relations, and conceptualizing individual circumstances within group-based social structures. From this perspective, equality law cannot reduce to non-discrimination only, of course, but requires also institutional positive obligations to transform the structures that systematically produce overexposure of women to discrimination. However, if vulnerability is conceived without considering the substantive dimension of equality and just focus on the definition of group, this kind of concept entails the risk of reproducing the very otherness and marginalization that is supposedly intended to eliminate. Although gender equality policies usually redound in special measure to include women, gender should not be understood as a synonym of women. Gender is the set of social structures to which both masculine and feminine social identities are constructed and represented. It is not only women who have gender, of course, also men have it. It is not only women who are hampered by the role and expectation that are socially attributed to them, men also are. Gender structures shape our bodies, behavior, choices, and desires, and constrict both femininity and masculinity within a dichotomous opposition. More importantly, gender structure does not work in isolation. To say it with Patricia Collins, gender operates within a complex matrices of domination where race, class, sexuality, and geopolitical location also plays essential roles. Although critics to gender essentialism are generally accepted among academics, European equality policies still rely on essentialized conceptualization of woman that as a subject, as a norm that is white, citizen, Christian, heterosexual, and a second earner working mother. So all that are depicted as racialized black, non-citizen, Muslim, unemployed, lesbian, and solo mothers are depicted as exception to this norm. And being exceptions, they are described as particularly vulnerable groups. That means that they are at the bottom of equality policies in the final paragraph, just to sake of including everyone, but they are actually not the target of the equality policies. So what I argue is that the concept of women's vulnerability has some limits that are related to three aspects. The first is the very definition of women as a group, who is the reference norm. The second limit is related to the features of the group. Are those features given and immutable, or are they changing and questionable? And then the scope of the group. Are the groups homogeneous? Through processes of social subjectification, women are identified as vulnerable group because they are represented as naturally possessing physical and psychological characteristics that place them in a situation of greater disadvantage compared to men. Women as vulnerable group are defined as a variation or better a deficit compared with a paradigm that is established as a legal standard. This standard is represented by the adult citizen who is white, independent, educated, and has unaltered cognitive capacity as ability of movement, the self-determination, and of course is man. From an a priori definition of the subject of theory and the praxis of justice, women are defined as a group because they are not men. Disabled people are a group because they do not possess the physical capacities that are considered normal. Blacks are a group because they are not white. Migrants because they are not citizens. In contrast, men are never a group, nor white people, and similarly, physically and mentally healthy people are not. They are simply the norm. In addition, those characteristics of the group are defined as natural and singular. By invisibilizing social construction and therefore the possibility of alternative construction, those characteristics become an inescapable prison. Belonging to a disadvantaged group can, of course, can limit individual possibilities, but defining such feature as an inescapable adverse situation is also anchoring. When vulnerable means weakness, there is no possibility of exit. And vulnerability in this way ends up limiting rather than opening up possibilities and create victims that are unable to subvert the social order, the unjust social order. For example, the quotas that using the woman and steer approach include women into the labor market, political institution, or decision making, do not change in depth the gendered social structure. So in the end, they reproduce, because they are used as the unique gender policy strategy. In the end, they reproduce women's vulnerability and exclusion. And finally, the concept of group-based vulnerability assumes an internal homogeneity of women as group and ignores the existence of significant differences among women based on differences that can be understood through class, sexual orientation, race, national origin, and religion. So this idea of woman as a transcultural concept in some way depict women as a pre-social group with common goals. Such a notion places women out of history and social structures and ignores that women are constituted instead through this social structure. Through this way, multiple discrimination is represented as a problem of arithmetical sum. As if we can describe the situation of migrant women adding to sexism, xenophobia. And of course, this conceptualization in some way entails that all the men together are the enemy. Such a concept ignored that in contemporary societies are asymmetrically constructed around gender, heterosexuality, race, class, and neocolonialism and national relations. Indeed, to say it with normal archon, one can become a woman also in opposition to other women. This concept, essentialized concept of group-based gender vulnerability, leads to exclusionary equality models because it leaves out of the reach of gender equality policies men on the one side and women from other countries or culture and religion from the other. Through this way, the equality policies are incomplete because they cannot achieve the transformative aim that is needed to really achieve equality in the substantive dimension. We said that equality, legal equality, formal equality is not enough. Equality of opportunity is not enough. We need to transform in that society. The exclusionary dimension of equality models is detrimental to both women and men because it perpetuates traditional gender roles. On the one hand, because it deprives most men of the opportunity to care for and raise their own children. On the other hand, current equality regimes increase the inequalities between women because women in citizen women, they relegate the unrecognized care work to low-paid migrant women with irregular status that suffer lack of legal protection and overexposure to right violation. The vulnerability of those women is different from their fellow migrant and from women citizens. Gender equality, indeed, is inextricably entangled with national boundaries and racialized entitlement of citizenship along with socio-economic hierarchies. Gendered, bordered, and racialized vulnerabilities come here to the fore. The concept of intersectionality allows for including neocolonialism, borders, and international migration as an essential dimension to analyze gender injustice, to rethink the subject of the theory of justice, and elaborate alternative theories of global justice. I use the case of Spanish gender equality regime because I think it makes clear what kind of perverse effect the exclusionary equality policies can have in the age of transnational migration. The current conceptualization of equality is still based on fixed and segmented categories. Its translation to public policies implies the adoption of measures that do not appropriately protect individuals who are located across multiple borders. Those policies further marginalize people who are systematically excluded from our society, such as migrant women working in the care sector. By not including men in the sphere of care, gender equality policies in the most advanced countries end in relegating care to exploited migrant women, and thus reproducing vulnerability through global care chains. I call for reconsidering intersecting, gendered, racialized, and border vulnerabilities as crucial categories for global justice. Migrant caregiver need to be brought center stage, as Alex said before, and gender equality needs to be recognized as dependent on the global context. If we do not deeply transform gender roles and the patterns of distribution of care, we will achieve gender standards within the borders of EU democracies at the expenses of migrant women living in Europe. In order to be for everybody, gender equality needs to accomplish its substantive, intersecting, and transformative dimension. When equality policy will be able to address intersecting, gendered, and border structural vulnerabilities, there will be a crucial step toward global justice. Thank you.